They told him he was just a groundskeeper, not a Marine, not anymore, not after 40 years of silence and no one left alive to remember. "You take good care of the place, Paul," the hospice volunteer said absently, placing the bland lunch tray on the table beside his chair, never once glancing at the shadow box tucked under his arm. He didn't correct her. He never did. He just gave the same quiet nod he always gave, like he had for decades, first on the battlefield, then to the families who cried at Section 14 of Granger Hill Cemetery. The day he passed, no one noticed the sealed box resting beneath the blanket on his lap. But the funeral director, curious and respectful, opened it. Inside were 2 silver stars, 3 purple hearts, and a citation personally signed by General Darren Whitlock, retired Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. No one in the room could speak. That was the first time they realized. The man who spent 40 years sweeping leaves from forgotten graves was the reason half of those names even had stones. And they had buried him with barely a fold in the flag. If you agree that some heroes shouldn't have to die to be seen, like and subscribe, because the ones who stay quiet the longest often have the loudest legacies. The grave had only been there for a week. Fresh soil, a modest stone etched with the name Major Paul Revere Jansen, USMC, 1949 to 2023. No grand speeches. No military flyovers. Just a folding chair, 3 rain-soaked mourners, and a flag that kept slipping from the pool because no one thought to secure it properly. Paul didn't have children. No surviving siblings. The town called him caretaker or grounds guy and barely knew his last name. But Earl knew. Earl was 83, bent from the years, and still showed up every Monday to walk the perimeter of Granger Hill Cemetery like he had sensed Nam. Earl had buried friends here. He'd helped Paul clean graffiti more times than he could count. But that Monday morning, Earl found something different. A neon green smear across Paul's stone. Spray paint. A cracked bottle of malt liquor half buried in the grass. And the word "Faker" scrawled in jagged letters across the marble like a wound. It wasn't random. It wasn't mischief. It was deliberate. Earl didn't yell. Didn't rage. Just knelt, pulled out an old rag from his coat pocket, and began to scrub. A teenager had posted the act to Snapgram or Talkbook, whatever they called it, laughing with his friends as he sprayed the words, stepping on the grave for emphasis. "Ain't no war hero named Revere," he said, as the camera shook with laughter. But he just made that up. The video got 112 shares by nightfall. And one of those shares ended up in a group chat called Echo Unit, still standing, a dormant Marine veteran thread that hadn't pinged in 5 years. Within minutes, the silence broke. "That's Jansen's grave. Major Revere Jansen. Send coordinates." No expletives. No threats. Just a decision. By sunrise, the caretaker's lot was full black SUVs, dusty trucks, one sedan with a Marine emblem hanging from the rearview mirror. They didn't speak at first. Just lined the perimeter of the cemetery in full dress blues and civilian jackets heavy with pins. Earl stood at the gate and nodded, his eyes full. 37 men. 3 women. Some with canes. One in a wheelchair. Every one of them had fought under Major Jansen's command. Most owed him their lives. The local sheriff tried to ask what was happening but was met with a wall of silence and a single sentence. "We're just here to honor the man who kept us alive." The teen who vandalized the grave didn't show up at first, until a text from school said the cemetery was surrounded by uniformed strangers. "It's about that guy," one of his buddies said, laughing. "You really stirred him up. He came by that afternoon, shoulders high, still smirking. Until he saw the boots. Until he saw the folded flags. Until he saw the man in a wheelchair holding Paul's shadow box in his lap, open to reveal the medals, the commendations, and the photo of Paul with a dozen Marines in desert camo, their hands over their hearts. "This him?" one of the veterans asked, nodding at the teen. "You the one who called our CO a liar?" The boy tried to speak, then stopped. "Do you know what that man did?" another vet said, quieter this time. "Do you know why we're still breathing?" The silence that followed didn't need threats. It didn't need raised voices. It was the kind of silence that breaks people open. The sheriff didn't arrest the teen. He didn't have to. Because when he was handed the same rag Earl used that morning and told to clean the stone himself, with the Corps watching, he did it with shaking hands. One of the younger Marines handed him a flag. "Next time you want to go viral," he said softly, "start with knowing what this means." That night, no one left the cemetery. Not really. A few stood through the evening ray. A few lit candles. Someone planted a small sign beside Paul's headstone. Handwritten. It read, "Your watch is over, Major. Ours just started." and by the next morning, the word faker was long gone. But the shadow of that moment would stay forever. Because for once, the silence spoke first. The rain had stopped, but the weight in the air hadn't. Granger Hill Cemetery was no longer just a resting place. It was a live wire, humming with something that couldn't be named, only felt. And as the second day broke through with low gray skies and wet grass underfoot, the town had already begun to shift, though no one admitted it aloud. The teen who had spray-painted Paul Jansen's grave didn't return to school that morning, not because he was suspended, but because he couldn't lift his eyes. Without feeling them all on him, the people who used to laugh at his jokes now choosing their words more carefully, whispering things like that was his grave, or he was real. And meanwhile, inside the town's modest VFW hall, the Marines who had come from every corner of the country had gathered without fanfare, some in uniform, most in civilian jackets patched with years of silent service. And they laid out the things Paul had left behind that no one knew he'd saved, a folded operations map from Cunard Province marked with red tape and pencil notations. A torn photo of 6 men inside a crumbling village school Paul had held long enough for evac to clear, and a final letter he'd written, unsent, dated 2 years ago, addressed simply to Echo Unit, with one line underlined. If they ever ask, tell them I didn't save lives because I was a hero. I did it because I knew who I was fighting beside. That letter broke something in the room, something none of them had realized they were still carrying, and the silence after it was read wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Back at the cemetery, the townspeople began to gather in quiet awe. Watching as folding chairs were placed, as a makeshift memorial of flags and candles grew by the hour, as a news crew set up but dared not interrupt, the sheriff asked if there would be a formal statement. But the oldest Marine there, Colonel Roger Benton, now 90, half-blind, and still sharp as a blade, simply said, "We don't make statements. We make presents." And it was true, because what unfolded that afternoon wasn't a speech or a protest or a press moment, it was something much heavier, a lesson in reverence for men who had seen death too closely to ever mock it. And as the teenager was quietly brought forward, not by force but by his father, pale and trembling, there was no lecture waiting, only Earl standing by Paul's grave, holding the spray can that had been left behind, now washed clean, and extending it toward the boy with a single sentence. "Tell him yourself." The boy froze, his throat closing, but eventually he knelt, not because someone told him to, but because it was the only thing that felt right, and he placed the can at the foot of the stone and whispered something no one could hear, but everyone felt. Because the Marines stepped forward one by one after that, not to punish, but to share who Paul had been, the man who shielded them from sniper fire in Sanjin, the one who stayed behind to rescue a translator when the building collapsed, the one who refused evacuation until every single soldier was accounted for. Even after shrapnel had torn through his ribs, a man who returned to the States, disappeared into cemetery groundskeeping, and never once told a soul what he'd done. Because he didn't need to, not until they made the mistake of calling him a liar in death. The town watched this unfold in stunned reverence. People who had passed him 100 times without looking now stood with their hats off. Veterans they hadn't known still lived here were now standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet rows, and the boy who started it all didn't leave early, didn't make excuses. He stayed until the last candle was lit, the last story was told, and when he walked home that night with his father, who hadn't spoken until then, he finally asked, "Why didn't anyone ever tell us?" And the father said, "Because we stopped asking," and that answer hung in the air like smoke. That evening, the cemetery gate was closed softly, and a new plaque had been staked into the ground beside Paul's grave, bearing his name, rank, and years of service. But below that, a simple line had been etched in hand-carved brass. "He kept the silence so we could come home." It didn't make national news, didn't trend on any platform, and there were no hashtags or choreographed responses, just a slow, quiet ripple that started in a cemetery and carried into the town like a hymn no one remembered learning. And in the weeks that followed, Granger Hill changed not by decree, but by choice. The town council voted unanimously to fund a full restoration of the veterans section, something Paul had requested in a letter years ago and had been denied due to budget limitations. But now no one argued, not after the mayor herself attended the next Sunday service and couldn't speak through her tears during the moment of silence. The high school added a wall inside the main hall, the quiet ones, featuring photos of local veterans who never asked for attention but had earned it anyway. And the first picture installed was a grainy shot of Paul Revere Jansen standing next to a crumbling headstone, holding a rake in one hand and an American flag in the other, his Face calm, eyes distant. The caption below reading, "He never told us. He never had to." As for the boy who'd started it all, something had shifted, not publicly, not in some dramatic apology video, but deeper, more permanent. He started volunteering twice a week at the cemetery, never filmed it, never spoke of it. Just showed up and got to work, cleaning stones, trimming weeds, and helping Earl with the reeds, especially on the ones no one visited anymore. He even carried Paul's old rake, duct-taped and worn, because Earl had handed it to him one day and said, "You carry this now." And that's all it took. Meanwhile, the Marines who'd gathered that week didn't vanish back into the fog. They stayed in touch, organized quietly, and sent letters to Paul's remaining contacts, arranging for a full posthumous military ceremony. And though Paul had already been buried, they made space for something deeper, a vigil, a final watch, a last salute not just for a fallen brother, but for the silence he'd carry longer than anyone should have had to. When the day came, 3 months later, every single one of them returned, some limping, some graying, some flown in at their own expense, and they stood at dawn, boots planted in cold grass, facing Paul's stone with their backs to the rising sun. The exact way he'd taught them to hold perimeter during patrols. A trumpet played, but no one spoke, not until a single black SUV pulled up the dirt path, and an older man stepped out in full dress uniform, medals flashing in the morning light. General Darren Whitlock, retired commandant. Just as the signature in Paul's box had said, he approached the grave, saluted long and slow, then turned to the gathered crowd and simply said, "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for this man," before placing a sealed envelope at the base of the stone. Then he turned to the young man with the rake, standing near the edge of the formation, unsure if he belonged, and beckoned him forward. The boy hesitated, then stepped up, and the general placed something small and heavy into his hand. Paul's dog tags, strung on the same chain he'd worn all those years, warm from the general's grip, and said, "You may not have known him, but you helped finish what he started." That night, as the sun dipped below the trees, Earl sat alone by the stone, staring at the plaque until the air turned cold, then placed a new page into Paul's shadow box, just 6 words, written in the same hand the boy now recognized as Earl's. "The watch never ends. We see you." And long after the world forgot again, long after the cameras stopped rolling and the uniforms faded into memory, the stone still stood, clean and honored, not because of the government, not because of obligation, but because of one mistake, one lesson, and a circle of men who refused to let silence bury the truth again.